It was a warm morning in downtown Los Angeles, the kind that makes even the courthouse steps feel like a stage. Inside the courtroom buzzed with a quiet hum, shuffling papers, low murmurs, the occasional clearing of a throat. It should have been a routine day at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, but people had come in early seats filled faster than usual. Something was different. Everyone knew the case on the docket wasn't about the law as much as it was about what happens when arrogance walks straight into justice. The doors swung open with a whisper of drama, and in she came Brittany Langford, a name that had graced more society columns than court dockets. She was late, of course. Draped in designer clothes and hiding behind oversized sunglasses, she walked down the center aisle like it was a runway. Her attorney trailed behind her, looking as if he wished he could disappear. Brittany didn't seem to notice or care that every eye in the room was now on her. She stopped halfway to her seat, flicked her wrist to tell her lawyer to move, and placed her expensive handbag down with a flourish. The courtroom, built for order and respect, had never felt quite so unsettled. Moments later, the door behind the bench opened and the room shifted. Judge William Grant stepped in, tall and composed, carrying the kind of presence that needed no announcement. The murmurs died. The air stilled. In his mid-50s, Judge Grant was known for his sharp mind, his unshakable sense of fairness, and a calm authority that never needed to shout. "All rise," the bailiff said. Everyone stood except Brittany, who hesitated. She let out a sigh loud enough to turn heads, before finally rising, her expression unreadable behind those sunglasses. When she did speak, her tone was flat, almost bored. "Yeah, that's me," she said when asked to confirm her name, barely lifting her eyes from the table. Judge Grant didn't react. He opened the file and began reading the charges: several parking violations and one incident of reckless driving. On paper, it wasn't earth-shattering, but the atmosphere said otherwise. There was a weight in the air, something no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. This wasn't going to be a typical hearing, and Brittany Langford was about to learn that not everything in life can be bought dismissed or waved away. Not in Judge Grant's courtroom. Not today. Judge Grant's voice was steady as he read through the charges, straightforward really. A string of parking violations and one serious incident involving reckless driving. The kind of case that usually came and went with little notice. But as his words filled the room, so did something else. Tension, a quiet current that seemed to run beneath every bench and every breath. Because while the law itself was routine, Brittany Langford's behavior was anything but. She shifted in her chair, arms crossed tightly over her chest, like a child bored at the dinner table. Her perfectly manicured nails began to tap rhythmically against the wooden desk, sharp little clicks that cut through the quiet. Each tap seemed to carry its own message. "This is a joke. I don't belong here. Let's get this over with." Her attorney leaned in, whispering something low and urgent. Brittany didn't even turn to him. She flicked her wrist again, that same motion from before, as if waving away a gnat. It was clear she wasn't interested in advice, or rules, or anyone else's time. The courtroom, full of seasoned staff and patient regulars, started to take notice. Eyes lifted from notepads, backs straightened. Something was shifting and everyone could feel it. This wasn't just entitlement anymore, it was defiance. When Judge Grant paused to ask Brittany to confirm her name for the record, she barely looked up. "Yeah, that's me," she said flatly, as if checking in for a hair appointment. A soft wave of murmurs rolled through the room. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering briefly above the keys. Judge Grant adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Brittany. His tone never rose, never wavered. "Ms. Langford," he said, "in this courtroom, we maintain a certain level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Brittany gave him a smirk, the kind that didn't come from confidence, but from someone who'd never been told no and didn't plan on starting today. She leaned back in her chair, twirling a strand of blonde hair between her fingers, and said with syrupy sarcasm, "Sure thing, Your Honor." A few people in the back gasped quietly. Brittany's attorney shut his eyes for a moment and rubbed his temple. Judge Grant showed no visible reaction. He returned his gaze to the file as if her words were just more ink on the page. "Do you understand the charges brought against you today?" He asked, his voice calm, his eyes fixed on her. Brittany let out a loud sigh. "Honestly, no. I mean, we're talking about a couple of dumb parking tickets and someone who got scared because I hit the gas too hard. This whole thing is a waste of time." You could feel the air go still. Every eye turned to Judge Grant, who slowly closed the folder in front of him. He removed his glasses and set them down carefully, deliberately. The silence that followed was thick. Even Brittany's smugness seemed to falter just for a beat. "Ms. Langford," he said quietly, "I would advise you to choose your words very carefully from this point forward." But she wasn't ready to stop. "What?" "It's true," she said, leaning forward. "It's not like I hurt anyone. This is ridiculous." And in that moment, it became clear she had no idea where she was. Not really. Not in a courtroom. Not in the presence of a man who had spent decades upholding the law, not for prestige or pride, but for something deeper. Something rooted in dignity. Judge Grant didn't respond right away. He sat back, his fingers interlaced on the bench, his gaze never leaving hers. "You believe this is ridiculous?" he asked. Brittany gave a short laugh. "I mean, yeah. It's not like I robbed a bank. This is all just overkill." She waved her hand through the air again, brushing off the proceedings like lint from her sleeve. Judge Grant nodded slowly. "I see," he said. "Let me clarify something for you." He leaned forward slightly, his voice still even, but with a new weight behind it. "You are charged not only with reckless driving, but with endangering a pedestrian's life. The law does not measure accountability by the size of the offense, but by its impact." "Do you understand?" That Brittany rolled her eyes once more and mumbled under her breath. "Sure, whatever you say." It was soft, but in that heavy silence the words carried like thunder. Judge Grant's eyes narrowed just slightly, not with anger, but with something sterner. Disappointment. "Ms. Langford," he said, "do you recall the incident that brought you here?" "From 2 weeks ago," Brittany shrugged. "Some guy stepped into the street, I honked, he moved. End of story." "End of story," Judge Grant repeated. "Is that how you see it?" She nodded. "Yeah. No harm, no foul." He opened a second file, flipping to a page inside. Then he spoke not to Brittany, but to the entire courtroom. "Let the record show," he said clearly, "that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, was a 67-year-old retired school teacher. He was crossing the street legally within the crosswalk when Ms. Langford accelerated toward him. He stumbled to avoid her car and injured his wrist. He has since sought medical treatment and continues to experience pain." Brittany's expression changed for the first time. Her smirk slipped. She looked toward her attorney, who whispered something in her ear, but she waved him off once again. "I didn't hit him," she muttered. "He's fine." Judge Grant turned back to her. "Does that still sound like no harm, no foul to you?" Before she could answer, he added, "Because Mr. Lopez is here today, in this courtroom." There was a collective stillness. Brittany's eyes flicked to the second row, and there he was. Mr. Lopez, a slender man in a navy sweater, his arm in a sling. He didn't glare. He didn't scowl. He simply looked at her with a kind of quiet sorrow that didn't need words. Brittany shifted in her seat, but for all her bravado, something in her faltered. Her chin lowered. Her voice, though still defensive, softened. "I'm sure he's okay," she muttered. Judge Grant leaned in just enough to command the room without raising his voice. "Your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes, Ms. Langford. But this case is no longer just about a traffic violation. It's about what we teach and what we allow. When privilege blinds us to the harm we cause, that is when the law must step in." The room was utterly still. No one dared move, not with what was coming next. Because what Brittany didn't realize, not yet, was that her sentence wouldn't just come in numbers. It would come in understanding, in perspective, and Judge Grant was just getting started. The silence that followed Judge Grant's words seemed to stretch for miles. Every person in the courtroom, from the bailiff to the back row, sat still, eyes fixed on Brittany Langford, whose polished exterior had begun to crack. Judge Grant's gaze remained on her, firm but not unkind. "You said earlier this was all overblown," he said softly, "that no one was hurt, that it was no big deal. But now I ask you again, do you still believe that?" Brittany's shoulders tensed. Her eyes flicked quickly to the second row where Mr. Edward Lopez sat. He hadn't moved. His arms, still in a sling, rested gently on his lap. He was older, late 60s, with a weathered face that spoke of years in front of chalkboards and school buses. There was no bitterness in his expression, no revenge, just a kind of quiet weariness. The kind that made you pause. Brittany shifted in her seat, but her tone still carried an edge. "I didn't hit him," she muttered. "He wasn't seriously hurt." Judge Grant didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ms. Langford," he said, "you didn't have to strike Mr. Lopez to cause harm. Recklessness is not measured by damage alone, but by the disregard that allowed it to happen." Brittany opened her mouth to protest, but Judge Grant held up one hand, not sharply, but with gentle finality. "You've had your chance to speak. Now I'd like Mr. Lopez to have his." There was a ripple in the courtroom, a shift of weight and attention. All eyes turned to the elderly man as he slowly stood. He wasn't tall and his voice wasn't loud, but the room gave him the kind of silence usually reserved for something sacred. "I was just trying to get across the street," he said simply. "Same crosswalk I'd used for years. I saw the light, stepped out, and next thing I knew, I was stumbling backward, trying not to fall." His fingers touched the sling gently. "I caught myself with my arm. Ended up spraining my wrist. It still hurts when I write." He paused, looking straight at Brittany. "I don't believe she meant to hurt me," he continued, "but she never even stopped. Not to check if I was okay, not to say sorry." Brittany looked down at the table, her confidence now muted, replaced by a kind of stunned stillness. Mr. Lopez went on, not with anger, but with something deeper, disappointment. "She looked at me like I was in her way, like I was the problem. And I guess that hurt more than the fall." His voice cracked just a little, but he cleared his throat and smiled faintly. "I didn't come here to punish her. I just came here hoping maybe she'd listen." He sat back down slowly. The room remained still. Judge Grant folded his hands. "Thank you, Mr. Lopez." Turning back to Brittany, he continued, "What you've just heard, Ms. Langford, is grace. That man had every right to be angry. He had every right to demand more than just an apology. And yet here he sits, offering you the chance to hear, to understand." Britain's eyes were fixed on the floor. Her hands, once folded confidently in front of her, now fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. The walls she'd carefully built were starting to weaken, though she hadn't realized it yet. "This courtroom," Judge Grant said, "isn't here to shame people. It's here to hold them accountable and, when possible, to help them grow." He leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Langford, your actions showed a dangerous disregard for another person's life. But your words, your inability to recognize his pain, are what concern me most. Because harm isn't always about broken bones. Sometimes it's the harm we cause when we look at someone and refuse to see them." Brittany blinked, her lips parting just slightly. No words came out. "I'm not interested in theatrics," Judge Grant said gently. "And I'm not interested in punishing you for the sake of headlines. What I am interested in is whether this experience can open your eyes." There was a pause, a long one, long enough to make everyone wonder if Brittany might finally speak. She didn't, not right away, but then just above a whisper, she said, "I didn't know." Judge Grant nodded, though his expression didn't change. "Maybe not, but ignorance isn't an excuse when it becomes habit, and it becomes habit when no one stops you." He glanced toward Mr. Lopez again. "That man tried to cross a street. That's all. And he's here giving you more understanding than most people would." Turning back to Brittany, his voice softened. "I don't believe you're a bad person, but I do believe you've lived a life that's shielded you from consequence. That ends today. He reached for the papers in front of him. We'll discuss sentencing shortly, but first I want you to sit with what's been said here. Really sit with it. Not like someone waiting for their turn to speak, but like someone ready to listen. The gavel didn't fall. Not yet. The room remained quiet, as if holding its breath for whatever was coming next. And Brittany Langford, for the first time in a very long time, didn't have anything to say. She just sat there surrounded by silence and began slowly to feel it. The hush in the courtroom lingered heavy and thoughtful. Judge Grant sat quietly for a long moment, his hands folded before him, eyes resting not on the file but on Brittany Langford, who sat now without her usual flair, her shoulders tense, her gaze lowered. Sis. Langford, he began, his voice calm, as ever your case has been reviewed thoroughly. And while the charges alone would typically result in fines, in some community service, what concerns me more is what we've all witnessed here today. Brittany looked up slowly, a flicker of unease settling behind her eyes. Your actions, though reckless, might have been brushed off by many as a youthful mistake, he continued. But it's your attitude, your indifference to the harm you caused, and your lack of empathy that cannot go unaddressed. He paused, then leaned forward, letting the words come with the weight of purpose. Since you seem unconcerned about the consequences of your behavior, perhaps it's time you experience them in a way that offers perspective. Not punishment, Miss Langford, but reflection. Her eyebrows pulled together just slightly. What does that mean? She asked, her voice thinner than before. Rather than answer immediately, Judge Grant gestured to the bailiff, who stepped forward and handed him a small stack of documents. The judge took a moment to read aloud the official sentencing fines for the traffic violations, 200 hours of court-ordered community service and participation in a sensitivity training course. Brittany exhaled sharply, her posture stiffening. Fine, she said, if that's what it takes to get this over with. But Judge Grant hadn't finished. And in addition to these terms, he said, looking up, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the downtown women's shelter. You will report at 8 a.m. each morning. You will work directly with the staff and the guests, and you will listen, really listen to the stories of those who've lived through circumstances far removed from your own. The room stirred, a few heads turned. This wasn't a typical sentence. Brittany stared at him, stunned. You want me to hang out with homeless people, she said, almost laughing. That's not my problem. Judge Grant's expression didn't change, but his tone turned cold with quiet finality. It's precisely that mindset that brought you here, Ms. Langford. This isn't about inconvenience. This is about learning the value of empathy and humility. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. But Brittany shook him off, rising slightly from her chair. This is insane, she snapped. You can't make me do this. Sit down, Judge Grant said gently but firmly. This court has full authority to assign community service where it sees fit. Should you fail to comply, I assure you the consequences will be far less lenient. Brittany slowly sank back into her seat, flushed with anger and disbelief. She didn't argue again, but her silence wasn't acceptance. It was resistance. A kind she'd grown up learning how to wear like a second skin. Judge Grant let the silence settle again, then removed his glasses and laid them down. Ms. Langford, he said, this courtroom doesn't exist to humiliate. It exists to guide people back to a sense of responsibility. Too often, privilege becomes a barrier between us and the consequences of our actions. It breeds detachment, and over time, detachment hardens into something worse, indifference. He glanced toward Mr. Lopez, who sat quietly still nursing his injured arm. The man you nearly injured has asked for no vengeance, no punishment. Only that you begin to understand. That in itself is grace, and it deserves to be honored with effort, not dismissal. Brittany's expression faltered. She opened her mouth to respond but stopped short. Something had changed. The courtroom felt heavier now, as though every person present was quietly urging her to drop the mask. Judge Grant continued, softer now. Mr. Lopez told us something before this hearing. He said, I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand, because if she doesn't, one day she'll hurt someone in a way she can't undo." The words hung in the air like a quiet bell tolling in a small chapel. Brittany swallowed, her voice smaller than before. "He said that, yes," Judge Grant replied, "and I believe you can choose to honor that hope." He tapped the papers lightly, his tone returning to the business at hand. "You will begin your sentence this coming Monday. The shelter has already been contacted. Your supervisor will provide weekly progress reports to this court. You will be expected to perform your duties with respect, and I strongly suggest you open yourself to the experience." For a long while, Brittany said nothing. She didn't nod. She didn't protest. She just sat there as if still trying to decide whether this was real. Judge Grant rose from his seat. "This hearing is adjourned," he said. The gavel struck with a quiet but final sound. As he exited the courtroom, the gallery began to stir. Reporters rose. People murmured to each other about the unusual sentence in the girl who just minutes ago had thought herself untouchable. Brittany remained seated. Her lawyer leaned in again, speaking quietly, but she barely heard him. Her eyes flicked to the second row where Mr. Lopez was slowly rising, adjusting the sling on his arm. He didn't look at her with bitterness or victory, just something even harder to bear: kindness. And maybe hope. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Cameras flashed as Brittany stepped into the sun, her lawyer shielding her from questions. "Do you feel the sentence was fair, Ms. Langford?" one reporter called. She snapped back without thinking, no comment. But once inside the car, her posture slumped. The sunglasses she wore couldn't hide the weight settling into her face. For the first time in a long while, Brittany Langford wasn't sure where her world ended and where someone else's might begin. And that Judge Grant hoped was the very first step. Monday came with a chill in the air, not the kind that seeps into your skin, but the kind that settles deep in the chest when you're walking into something unknown. Brittany Langford stood outside the downtown women's shelter just before 8 a.m., wrapped in a tailored coat, her usual oversized sunglasses hiding more than just the morning light. Her heels clicked softly on the sidewalk, a sharp contrast to the worn concrete steps beneath her feet. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control of the day. There was no assistant, no curated schedule, just a court order, and a sentence she still didn't quite understand. The building itself was modest, weathered bricks, old windows, and a small, hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome, you are safe here." Inside, the hum of activity was already underway. Distant voices, clattering dishes, the shuffle of early footsteps. Life was happening here quietly and without ceremony. The front door opened before she could knock. "You must be Brittany," said a woman in her 40s, short hair tucked behind her ears, wearing an apron dusted with flour. Her tone wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't soft either, more like someone who'd seen too much to be impressed. "I'm Dana," she added. "Come on in, we've got work to do." Brittany followed her in, clutching her purse like a lifeline. The warmth of the shelter hit her instantly, not just the temperature, but something else, something harder to name. It smelled like breakfast old wood and hand soap. The walls were lined with small notices and colorful artwork, some done by children, some by women with names Brittany would soon learn. "Go ahead and leave your bag in the office," Dana said, pointing to a side room. "You'll be helping in the kitchen this morning. After that, we'll see what needs doing." Brittany hesitated. "The kitchen," she repeated, unsure whether to laugh or groan. Dana didn't flinch. "Yes, the kitchen. We cook here, we serve, we clean. You'll do all three." And so the day began. At first, Brittany said little. She moved awkwardly, washing vegetables, wiping counters, ladling oatmeal into plastic bowls. Her motions were stiff and hesitant, the muscles of service foreign to someone used to being served. The other volunteers, mostly women older than her, worked in practiced rhythm, quiet and efficient. They didn't fawn over her, didn't ask about her last name or her wardrobe. They simply treated her like one more pair of hands. And strangely, that unsettled her more than anything else. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, Brittany began to notice things. Small things. A young girl with tired eyes gently braiding her mother's hair at one of the cafeteria tables. An older woman quietly folding laundry, humming an old hymn. The way the staff moved through the space like anchors, steady, kind but firm. At lunchtime, Dinah handed her a tray. "Eat with the guests," she said. "No special treatment." Brittany hesitated, scanning the tables, unsure where to sit. A woman with soft eyes and deep laugh lines patted the seat next to her. "You can sit here, honey. We don't bite." Her name was Marie, a single mother of 3 boys, all under the age of 10. Over lukewarm soup and a peanut butter sandwich, Marie told her story not with bitterness, but with a quiet strength that left Brittany speechless. "I had a good job," once Marie said. "Then came the layoffs. Then my husband left. Took the car, emptied the account. You don't plan to end up here. Life just moves fast, and not always in your direction." Brittany listened, truly listened, for what felt like the first time in a long while. She didn't interrupt. She didn't pretend to understand. She just sat there, nodding slowly, the words sinking in like water on dry ground. That night, as Brittany drove home in silence, the city looked different. The lights weren't as bright. The streets weren't as smooth. Her car felt too quiet, too clean. And her thoughts, usually filled with her own image, were now occupied by faces she barely knew but couldn't forget. The next day was much the same. She returned quieter than before, her coat a little more wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She didn't ask what she'd be doing, she simply waited. And day by day, something small began to shift. She no longer flinched at peeling potatoes or wiping down the cafeteria tables. She stopped checking the clock every 10 minutes. And when someone dropped their tray or needed help finding their coat, she got up without thinking. It was never dramatic. There was no sudden epiphany, no sweeping orchestral moment. Just the slow, steady hum of humility taking root. She started asking names, listening to stories, laughing even. A real laugh, not the kind you give to charm a donor or impress a dinner guest, but the kind that comes when two people different as night and day find something in common. Dana noticed. "She's not there yet," she told one of the other staff quietly. "But she's looking, and sometimes that's all a person needs to start." By the end of the second week, Brittany had stopped wearing makeup to the shelter. Not out of defeat, but because it no longer felt necessary. The women she worked with didn't care what she looked like. They cared whether she showed up, whether she listened, whether she cared. And slowly, she did. Each night as she left the shelter, door would close behind her with a soft click. And each night she carried a little more of what she'd heard and seen back into her world of manicured lawns and hollow brunches. She still didn't know what this experience would become. But for the first time in her life, Brittany Langford was learning something that no prep school or privilege had ever taught her. She was learning how to see. The days passed with quiet rhythm. Each morning, Brittany Langford returned to the shelter a little earlier, her heels replaced by sneakers, her designer coats traded for plain sweaters and rolled-up sleeves. She still came in guarded, head down, arms crossed, but by the third week, the edges had softened. Something in her had shifted. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't anything she would have noticed on her own. But those around her saw it in the little things, how she held the door open longer than she needed, to how she asked if anyone wanted seconds before tossing leftovers, how she started greeting the women by name instead of glancing past them. She was still Brittany, but not the Brittany who had walked into Judge Grant's courtroom with a scoff and a flip of her sunglasses. This version of her, quieter, watchful, unsure but trying, was learning to live outside the safety of her own reflection. One rainy afternoon, she found herself peeling carrots beside Janelle, one of the regular volunteers. They worked silently for a while, the only sounds the gentle clatter of the kitchen and rain tapping against the windows. Then Janelle spoke without looking up. "You're different than you were that first day." Brittany paused. "Am I?" Janelle gave a small smile. "You are. Back then you looked like the smell alone might knock you over." Now you look like you belong." Brittany chuckled softly, embarrassed but oddly grateful. "I didn't know what to expect." "No one does," Janelle said, tossing a peel into the bin. "But the ones who stay long enough to see people really see them, they don't leave the same." Brittany was quiet for a moment. Then, almost as if confessing something to herself, she said, "I used to think I understood people. I don't think I did." Janelle didn't answer. She just handed her another carrot. Later that day, while helping sort donations in the back room, Brittany overheard a conversation between two women staying at the shelter. One of them, Marie, the mother of three she'd met on her first day, was comforting another woman who had just been turned away by a job interview. "They see our address and stop listening," the woman said, tears catching in her throat. "Like I'm not even a real person." Marie's response stuck with Brittany longer than she expected. "Keep showing up anyway," she said. "You still matter. Even when the world pretends you don't." That night, Brittany sat in her car long after the engine had started. She watched the rain streak down the windshield and thought about that phrase, "keep showing up anyway." For most of her life, she'd shown up to be seen, to be admired, envied maybe, but never challenged. The women at the shelter didn't show up for applause. They showed up for survival, for their kids, for their dignity. And in that difference, Brittany found something deeply unfamiliar: respect. By the end of the month, she had completed every required hour of her sentence, every dish washed, every floor swept, every meal served. But she didn't circle the last day on a calendar. In fact, she didn't mention it at all. Instead, she arrived that morning like she had every other hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, ready to work. There was a peace in the routine now, something grounding about being useful in a world that didn't care what label she wore. When Dana, the shelter coordinator, handed her a small envelope at the end of her shift, Brittany looked confused. "It's your completion letter," Dana said with a smile. "You did it." Brittany looked down at the paper in her hands. It should have felt like a ticket back to her old life. Instead, it felt like a mirror, a quiet reminder of who she'd been and who she might still become. "Thank you," Brittany said softly, "for not treating me like I was just passing through." Dana's smile softened. "We've all been the one who needed a second chance. Yours just came with a judge." 2 days later, Brittany returned to court. The same wood-paneled room, the same long bench. But the girl who walked in this time was different. Gone was the silk scarf and sunglasses. She wore a simple blouse, a neutral skirt, her hands folded in front of her, not as a pose, but from sincerity. Her lawyer gave her a brief nod, but this time she didn't hide behind him. Judge William Grant entered and took his seat. The room stood, then settled. When Brittany's name was called, she rose. Judge Grant adjusted his glasses, scanning the file in front of him. "Ms. Langford," he said, "you've completed your court-ordered community service and sensitivity training. I've received the weekly reports from the downtown women's shelter. By all accounts, you've fulfilled the terms of your sentence." Brittany nodded once. "But that's not what I'm most interested in," he added, closing the file. "I'm more interested in what you have to say." Brittany cleared her throat, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, "for not giving up on me, even when I made it hard." Judge Grant regarded her thoughtfully. "The justice system can hold people accountable," he said. "But change, real change, comes from within." She nodded. "I've seen that. I've felt it." He leaned back slightly. "Then perhaps this sentence has done more than check a box. Perhaps it's opened a door." And as Brittany walked out of that courtroom for the second time, there were no reporters chasing her, no flashing cameras, just sunlight on the courthouse steps and the quiet knowledge that something inside her had shifted. Not all at once, but enough to begin again. The sun hung low over Los Angeles as Brittany Langford stepped out of the courthouse for the last time. There were no flashing cameras, no press waiting by the sidewalk, just a warm breeze and the steady rhythm of footsteps on concrete. She paused at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the sky like she hadn't in a long while. Inside her coat pocket was a letter, her official proof of completion. But what she carried in her heart was harder to name. For a moment, her thoughts drifted to Mr. Lopez. She could still see his face in the courtroom that day, his quiet strength, his willingness to forgive. He hadn't wanted revenge. He wanted her to understand. And slowly over those weeks at the women's shelter, she did. She thought of Marie juggling motherhood and hope in equal measure, of Dana who never sugarcoated the truth but offered grace just the same, and of the dozens of faces she came to know, not as statistics or the less fortunate, but as women with names, stories, and dreams still burning despite everything they'd lost. What had started as punishment had become something else entirely. A mirror, a teacher, a doorway back to her own humanity. Sometimes justice isn't just about consequences, it's about connection, about recognizing that behind every law, broken, every wrong done, there's a deeper question. Can we do better? This story reminds us that grace doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's found in the quiet strength of someone who chooses forgiveness over fury, in a judge who speaks not to punish, but to awaken, in a stranger's willingness to tell you the truth even when it stings. And when we choose to listen, really listen, we open ourselves to change. And that change, slow and fragile as it may be, is what brings us back to each other. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe you've lived something like this, or maybe it reminded you of someone who helped you see the world a little differently. Feel free to share a comment in your own time and your own words. And if you'd like to hear more stories that speak quietly but truthfully to the soul about kindness, justice, and second chances, I hope you'll join us again. You're always welcome here. Take care of yourself and take care of one another. We all need that reminder sometimes.